Hello to all the audience around the world and in New York to today's webinar. I am Kian Tajbakhsh, and as the coordinator of the Committee on Forced Migration at Columbia University, which has organized this event, I am delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists today to help us understand the latest migration crisis in Venezuela and its implications for a wide range of international priorities and policies, ranging from commitments to humanitarianism to larger campaigns aimed at countering these kinds of problems throughout the global South. I would like to thank my colleague, Ms. Astrid Leiden, for organizing and moderating today's webinar, together with the Committee on Forced Migration member, Professor Jose Moya of Barnard College. Astrid Leiden is currently studying political science and Latin American and Caribbean studies at Columbia College, focusing on migration and human rights in the region. She is a late law scholar and a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow whose research centers on the Venezuelan migration crisis. She currently works in the research department of Servicio Jesuita a Migrantes Chile, specifically on the role of migrants in the rewrite of the Chilean constitution. And she is deeply involved with the forced migrant community in Venezuela in New York City. A Venezuelan American student herself, Astrid is an advocate for displaced Venezuelan community in the United States and other parts of the world. Before I turn it over to Astrid to introduce the speakers more fully, I would like to say a few words about the Committee on Forced Migration. The committee is an initiative of the Columbia Global Centers, led by Professor Safwan Masri, the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. Columbia Global Centers works within countries that host large numbers of refugees, including in cities such as Amman, Istanbul, Nairobi, and Tunis. Centers in Santiago, Chile, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, monitor forced migration in Latin America. In response to the pressing challenges posed by forced migration worldwide, the Global Centers established the Committee on Forced Migration in 2018. The committee brings together 60+ faculty from across Columbia schools and affiliates who work on forced migration. The goal of the committee is to maximize Columbia's ability to provide a university-wide platform to engage, support, and share information across Columbia's community of faculty, students, and researchers. We also act as a convener to bring together the world's thought leaders around the issue of global migration. This initiative is one of a number of forced migration-related activities that Global Centers supports, including the Columbia University Scholarship for Displaced Students, the Amman Mellon Foundation Global Centers Fellowship Program for Emerging Displaced Scholars, the New University in Exile Consortium, as well as a number of regionally focused forced migration-related programming hosted by our individual global centers. The committee has contributed to Columbia University's response to the Afghanistan crisis, directly helping displaced scholars and students, as well as Afghan members of our community who have been impacted by the recent crisis in Afghanistan. You can find more details about this and other initiatives at the Global Center's website and the Committee on Forced Migration's webpage. Today is the second event in a year-long online series on the theme of forced migration and the crisis of multilateralism. Our events in our series feature eminent Columbia and external experts and voices from the front lines. And please check the Committee on Forced Migration websites for future events we'll be having this year around the issues of climate change, public health, and the role of global cities in dealing with the issue of forced migration. So I thank you all for joining us for this event. And now I turn it over to you, Astrid.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you may be joining us from. And thank you very much for joining us today for such an important and pressing discussion Thank you, Kian, and the entire effort of the Columbia Global Center Committee on Forced Migration for this opportunity today to convene and bring attention to the very dire situation and case of Venezuela. I'm very honored to have been invited to organize this event together with Professor Moya to bring discussion and awareness to this situation and the greater crisis of the resulting migration crisis in the region and beyond, which today has been labeled the second largest forced migration crisis in the world, second only to Syria, seeing almost 6 million people flee in just a matter of years. I'm joined today by a panel of very impressive, inspiring, and distinguished academics and professionals whose work on Venezuela and its migration and refugee crisis has been fundamental to understanding and unpacking the human impact of this crisis and the necessary solutions to respond to it, along with the responsibility of both the region and the world as a whole. I thank each one of you for your presence here today and for the wonderful and important discussion we'll be having. I will introduce the panelists in the order that I will have them speak and present to us all before we move on to further discussion. And I wanted to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A portion of the event today. You should be able to see a small Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to send your questions in there so that we can direct them to our panelists and to the panel overall. So to begin introductions, we are first joined by Luisa Palacios, who is a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. She comes to the center after a multidisciplinary career in the intersection of energy, finance, and policy, serving as the first ever chairwoman of the Houston-based Citgo Petroleum Corporation. Dr. Palacios is the part of the editorial board of the Americas Quarterly, member of the Venezuela Working Group of the Atlantic Council, affiliated faculty at the Institute for Latin American Studies here at Columbia, and of IESA's School of Management and Public Policy in Caracas, Venezuela. Next, Ms. Fabiana Papayani is an economist who, after working for several years in the private sector and multilateral organizations, started working in Venezuelan politics in 2013, first as a consultant and then as a policy advisor and legislative director for the National Assembly, Representative Miguel Pizarro, and subsequently as his chief of staff in his role as commissioner to the United Nations and humanitarian aid for the Venezuelan interim government. In her role as chief of staff to Commissioner Pizarro, her work centered on the international response to the Venezuelan complex humanitarian emergency and the resulting migration crisis. As a consultant for NDI, Ms. Papayani is mapping the organizations and providing services to Venezuelan migrants in 4 Latin American countries and developing a communications toolkit on services and programs for Venezuelan migrants and refugees in receiving nations. Cristiano Rebecco is the director of the Office for Latino and Latin American Studies and associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Professor Doña Rebecco's work centers on migration decisions, migration policies, and access to social rights by Latin American immigrants in the Americas. His recent work relating to Venezuelan migration in the region includes What Do Immigrants Make of Immigration Policies? Insights from Interviews with Venezuelans in Chile, and Chile's retooled migration law offers more restrictions, less welcome. And finally, Gisela Zapata is an assistant professor in the Department of Demography and researcher at the Center for Regional Development and Planning of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. She is co-coordinator of the research group Comparative Analysis on International Migration and Displacement in the Americas, and her research focuses on international migration and displacement, migration policy, remittances, and the migration development nexus in Latin America. Professor Zapata's recent work looks at the response by the Brazilian government to Venezuelan migration, most recently progressive legislation but lukewarm policies, the Brazilian response to Venezuelan displacement, published by the International Organization for Migration's International Migration Journal. And to mention, both Professors Doña Rebecco and Professor Zapata have worked on a special issue coming out in the International Migration Journal by, again, the International Organization for Migration, titled Policies and Politics on Venezuelan Displacement in Latin America. And Professor Zapata's most recent work is featured in that issue. This issue will be launched this Thursday at 10 a.m. Eastern. I will send the link for the event in the chat for those of you interested in joining. Again, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I will now turn it over to Professor Luisa Palacios, who will begin. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. or good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. Thank you, Professor Takbash from Columbia University Committee on Forced Migration for the amazing work that you do. And I also wanted to give special thanks to Andrea for putting your heart and soul to organize this event. You are an example of how diasporas make a difference. Although this is an event about Venezuela's forced migration, my role today is to explain its origins. And it is really about the complex humanitarian crisis in Venezuela that could no longer be contained inside its borders, and therefore morphed into the worst refugee crisis that the Western Hemisphere has seen. I wanted to start by saying that while the most obvious explanation of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis is the severe economic deterioration seen in the country since 2014, the fact is that this is a very complex, multifaceted crisis that touches politics, economics, social, environment, institutions. And to shed light on some of this economic deterioration first, I think it's good to put some numbers. Venezuela has seen a significant decline in GDP per capita since 2014. The cumulative decline in GDP per capita in the country in the 2014-2019 period has been of more than 70%. In fact, multilateral organizations have coined Venezuela's economic collapse as one of the worst recorded in the country, by any country outside of war, civil conflict, or transition from a planned economy. This economic collapse was also accompanied by hyperinflation, which is a very rapid and uncontrolled increase in prices. To give you an idea, in December of 2018, Venezuelans were experiencing an inflation of 130,000% in relation to December of the previous year. Hyperinflations are extremely disruptive because they impact the poor and the unprotected in disproportionate ways and make it very difficult for economies to operate. There is an overwhelming consensus as its causes in the economic literature, and it's really about economic mismanagement, and more specifically about large fiscal deficits being financed by monetary financing, by printing money. These numbers, I think, help to explain how is it that Venezuela's poverty levels went from 30% in 2013 from 93% of the population in 2018. Even more dramatic is the extreme poverty that Venezuela now has. And it went from 11% of the population living in extreme poverty in 2013 to about 77% of the population living in extreme poverty in 2018. And extreme poverty refers to the incapacity to buy the basic foods. An assessment conducted by the UN World Food Program in 2019 argued or stated that one out of 3 Venezuelans is food insecure and requires assistance. The most dramatic toll is on the malnutrition of children under 5 years old. This explains why in household surveys explaining that ask the question, why do people migrate? The overwhelming response is the need to find work, economic reasons. I mentioned at the beginning that this crisis goes way beyond economics, and I want to spend the rest of the time talking about the collapse of public services, the destruction of the private sector, human rights violations, disregard for the rule of law, and environmental damage, as all playing a part in this Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. I have given you numbers in which I use 2014 as a starting point. And I do this because in the 2014-2015 period, there was a collapse in oil prices. And oil prices declined from about $100 per barrel to $50 per barrel. That is a 50% decline. This was rough for oil exporting countries, of which Venezuela is a very important example. But only Venezuela really developed into a full-blown humanitarian crisis. The question is why? And one of the main reasons is that during the time of high oil prices, Venezuela's government started to enact misguided and ideological policies that led to a period of massive expropriations of private sector companies in key sectors. such as electricity, agriculture, food production, telecommunications, manufacturing, finance. Moreover, predatory price controls, violations of property rights, growing macroeconomic imbalances, including mounting unpaid bills, was making it very difficult for just private companies to survive. According to a series of studies conducted by Transparency International, the number of state-owned companies in Venezuela went from 74 in 2001 to 706 in 2018. And explains also one of the problems or at least Transparency International argues that this is one of the reasons why there was widespread scarcity of goods in Venezuela during the collapse of the oil prices. It's the opacity, lack of governance, and accumulations of financial losses in most of the state-owned companies that also makes this a very complicated economic recession for Venezuela. There was also, during that time, a decline of about 50% in the number of private companies in the 2018 to 2017 period. So why is this important? It's because when the oil price collapsed, that also meant a significant decline of imports, which Venezuela had been increasingly dependent on, and meant that the government could no longer pay its debt or pay for the imports the country now needed for its basic functioning. Oil production did not escape this and also saw significant declines in the 2014-2018 period. And oil production is the livelihood of Venezuela. It declined by 1 million barrels per day during that time. And there was indeed a further decline of about 600,000 barrels per day in 2019 due to economic sanctions. Moreover, expropriations, indebtedness, and severe lack of maintenance in the oil sector has caused severe environmental damage that has had serious consequences for workers in Venezuela and for the population. According to news reports, there have been about 50,000 oil leaks and spills that were tracked between 2010 and 2016 in Venezuela. Venezuela refineries suffer regular unplanned shutdowns due to fires and blasts, including a major explosion in a major refinery complex in 2012 that killed more than 40 people. Venezuela's lack of proper maintenance of oil and gas production has meant that it's among the 7 countries that cause the most gas flaring in the world. In 2016, for example, the last time the National Oil Company reported about oil spills, analysts reported that there were about 18 oil spills per day in Venezuela. All of this has been very damaging to the country's ecosystem, has led to severe contamination of the country's water system, its coasts, its lakes, and it's contributing to the worsening of health conditions of its citizens. This energy-rich country, which is endowed with amazing natural resources, has also been incapable or have had significant difficulty in providing electricity to its citizens. And since 2004, the country has experienced frequent electricity blackouts that significantly has worsened the living conditions of all Venezuelans, and actually leave the country very vulnerable to climate change shocks and rainfall conditions. The pandemic comes and hits Venezuela in one of the most vulnerable sectors, the healthcare system. Human Rights Watch had already averted to the crisis in the health system by 2015. And from then on, the healthcare sector has been under severe stress. So by the time the pandemic hit, Venezuela was already suffering a scarcity of medicine that was rampant, public hospitals that were operating at a fraction of their capacity, a huge diaspora of doctors that had left a significant knowledge vacuum in Venezuela. And the woes of the healthcare system were compounded by severe disruptions of electricity and clean water. So by the time COVID hit, also Venezuela was already seeing the world's steepest rise in malaria cases and other vaccine-preventable diseases such as measles and diphtheria. Lastly, to this very complex picture comes the political crisis in the country that leads to increased repression, anti-democratic measures, significant increase in violations of human rights, gender violence. In addition, the increase in the kleptocratic nature of the Venezuela's regime has placed it at the very bottom of Transparency International Corruption Index. All of this leads to sanctions in the country, leads the government and some of its entities like the state-owned or company to be sanctioned. So in addition to all the considerations that we've discussed before, sanctions since 2019 are part of the complexity of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. My intention here was to present a broad picture of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis to explain why Venezuela is considered a fragile state by the OECD, which also believes that it's a great risk of not being able to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Understanding how Venezuela got here can also help in thinking about multilateral solutions to help the many Venezuelans in need, both inside and outside of the country, in order to ease the suffering caused by the country's humanitarian crisis, but mindful of issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, Andrea, I turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I will now turn it over to Ms. Papayani, who will continue our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's an honor to be invited and to share the panel with these esteemed professors. Well, Venezuela's migration is now the second biggest migrant crisis in the world, like Astrid said, second only to Syria and the first in the region. We hear that a lot, but what does it mean? As of February 2019, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency, Venezuela's economic and social crisis had led to the exodus of 3.4 million persons, most of which had left in the previous 12 months and had traveled to Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Chile, the main receiving countries, mostly by land. Compared to this, the movement of persons from the Northern Triangle to the United States that has been going on for longer. In fact, it went on from 1980 to 2015. The number of migrants from this subregion who were living in the United States stood at close to 3 million. So what makes this a crisis affecting the whole region is the large amount of people that have left Venezuela in the short amount of time. The United Nations Refugee Agency estimates that around 5,000 people leave the country per day on average. This mass exodus has had a huge impact in the region, starting with neighboring countries, with the biggest impact being received by Colombia and Brazil, but extending as far as Chile and Argentina. It is estimated that the number of Venezuelans in countries across Latin America rose from 700,000 in 2015 to almost 5 million in January 2022. In fact, as of January 10th, 2022, the amount of Venezuelans in destination countries is of 6.04 million persons, of which more than 4.9 million have stayed in the region, and of which only 2.6 million have been granted regular stay and residence status. The migration crisis has two sides. There is the immediate pressure on fiscal spending and labor markets in the recipient economies, but there is also the humanitarian problem, which is given by the fact that this migratory wave that has been taking place since 2014 was born out of need. As Dr. Palacios explained, it was born out of poverty, hunger, lack of basic services, but also out of needing to escape guerrilla violence and the violation of human rights, and that a vast majority of those migrating are in desperate need of humanitarian aid. Considering this situation, in April 2018, the United Nations Secretary General requested the International Organization for Migration and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to establish the Regional Interagency Coordination Platform for Refugees and Migrants from Venezuela, the R4V platform. Its function is to direct and coordinate the response to refugees and migrants from Venezuela who are seeking access to basic rights and services, protection, as well as self-reliance and social economic integration, and also response to the host communities, complementing government responses. The R4V is made up of UN agencies, civil society, religious organizations, and NGOs, among others, that coordinate their effort in 17 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. The 2019 regional plan estimated that there were 3.6 million Venezuelan migrants in need, of which the plan targeted 2.2 million people with financial requirements of $738 million for executing projects with 95 partners. By 2021, the regional plan estimated that there were 7.2 million Venezuelans in need, of which the plan targeted 3.3 million people with financial requirements of $1.44 billion to execute projects with 159 partners. The number here is higher than the number of migrants because it takes into account Also the pendular Venezuelans, the Colombians who are going back, and people who are in transit. So as you can see, this more than doubles the amount of people in need in just 2 years as the financial requirements. Figures for 2022 estimate 8.4 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees in need, with financial requirements of $1.79 billion. However, despite the donor community being very generous through the years, holding donor conferences in 2020 and 2021 that amounted commitments of 2.79 billion in 2020 and 2.35 billion in 2021, the Venezuelan migrant and refugee crisis is seriously underfunded. The Brookings Institution published an article in April 2021 comparing funding to the Syrian migrant crisis and to the Venezuelan crisis. Considering 2015 as the first year of the Venezuelan mass exodus, by the end of 2020, the number of Venezuelans in destination was estimated to be 5.3 million people, which is a similar number to the number of Syrian refugees by 2016, which was 5.5 million, 5 years after the beginning of the Syrian crisis. Brookings found that as of year 2020, for Syria, there had been over 20.8 billion of funding in total since the beginning of the exodus. In Venezuela, by 2020, the number was only 1.4 billion, a much smaller number, despite the similarity in the number of refugees. Based on these figures, the total funding per refugee amounted to $3,150 per Syrian and just $265 per Venezuelan. They estimated that if the appeal for the plan of 2021 was met, it would go up to $600. However, it wasn't met. In fact, only 44% of the appeal was met in 2021 to November. So comparison of funding, we are extremely grateful to the international community for helping us. Venezuela for years was thought of as a rich country, and it was an image of power and wealth that the Maduro regime has tried very hard to maintain for the past 6 years. It took a while for the international community to realize the gravity of the crisis. In fact, the international community has also supported humanitarian aid inside Venezuela. Since 2019, a humanitarian country team was established in Venezuela, led by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which every year leads the humanitarian needs overview with international and national partners, which is then transformed into the humanitarian response plan. However, there is a big gap between funding and financing needs in the response plan within the country as well. As these needs go unmet, more and more people will look for hope and a better future outside Venezuela. Estimates indicate that by 2023, as many as 10 million Venezuelans will have migrated. This amounts to 1/3 of the Venezuelan population. This is a humanitarian crisis, and sometimes it is hard to understand the breadth and depth of the crisis by just stating numbers. But these are human beings that desperately leave their home and their loved ones, knowing that in their path towards a better future, they will face hardships, hunger and cold in the best of cases, but also human trafficking, slavery, violence, and even death. Migrating is hard even in the best of cases, with visas, jobs, and a place to stay. The psychological impact of migration will take its toll on Venezuelans for a long time, for those who leave and for those of us who are left behind. However, it is necessary to underscore the profound need for hope that drives some people to face the hardships of traveling on foot, to cross the border to Colombia or Brazil and continue forward in search of a better future. Because those hardships on the way to better futures is better than staying here, like living some of the people I see every day on the streets looking for food, in the garbage, or those who make $2 a month, which is the minimum wage, and by those who have seen their loved ones killed by violence. In conclusion, we need better funding for the response plans, both for the one here in Venezuela and the one for migrants, with the hope of reducing the outflow of migration. But we also need countries to give protection status to Venezuelans, following the example given by Colombia, so that Venezuelans can be integrated in the local community, more capacity building for local NGOs in receiving countries that are not being funded by these international appeals and are not well equipped to manage such a big flow of migrants, and continued support for free and fair elections to solve the root of the problem.
Thank you very much, Fabiana, for that very in-depth and important overview of both the situation within the country and regionally. I will now pass it over to Professor Cristiano and Rebecco. Just a reminder to please continue to use the Q&A for any questions you may have for the end of our conversation. But Professor, I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Astrid, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel with such wonderful colleagues. Hello, everyone. In order to understand what's happening in Chile with Venezuelan migration, we need to put that migration into context of the last 30 years. As many of you know, Chile in 1990 returned to democracy after 17 years of dictatorship, and that at the same time signaled a increasing economic wellness in the country, and a country that was seen by many outside and until recently was seen by a lot of people as an example within Latin America, example in a country where peace and prosperity was easily achievable. That led to, or that is one of the reasons that many argue that led to an increase in international migration. In 10 years before, in the mid-1980s, Chile was an expelling country, was an emigration country, and that changed completely by 1995. So just as you can imagine, if you could think that in 1992, there were 115,000 foreign-born people, immigrants in Chile. That changed in 10 years to 184,000. And today we're talking about 1.5 million. So in 20 years, the immigrant population in Chile has increased from about 1.3 million people, which is significant and is one of the largest growth in any country in the world today. And in this 30 years, we've seen in Chile a set of waves. So during the 90s, we had a strong wave of Peruvian Ecuadorian migrants. In the 2000s, we have, while the Peruvians kept being the largest country for origin, Colombians started to be an increasing number. And after 2010, we have Haitians first, and then Venezuelans starting 2015. So we have these 4 or 5 clear moments associated with one specific migrant group. Now, in the case of Venezuela, 80% of all Venezuelans that are today in the country arrived after 2017. So 4 of 5 arrived in the last 4 or 5 years. Compared to Peruvians, for example, what was then the largest immigrant group, 66% of them arrived before 2017, right? So the last 5 years, the large immigration has been concentrated primarily in Venezuelans, but also on Haitians. And I keep on talking on both groups because there are parallels on the ways that these two groups have been treated by the government in the last few years. Just an example, in 1992, there were 2,400 Venezuelans in Chile, and today is the largest majority with 450,000 Venezuelan born in Chile. Now, in terms of politics, until last year, until March of last year, the immigration law that managed migration in Chile was the DL 1974. DL 90s. I'm blanking on the number right now, of course. It was a law that was developed in 1975, at the early years of the dictatorship. It was a law that it wasn't an immigration law. It was basically a visa administrative law that stated who could get a visa, who couldn't, and under what circumstances. That is clear. That is key because that law actually allowed, even in the context that was an anti-immigration law, etc., it allowed people to enter the country as tourists and then change their status to a labor visa or a student visa or a temporary visa after 3 months. And after 2 years, you would get the equivalent to a green card, your permanent residency, right? And that allowed migration or migrants to enter the country, look for jobs, and then eventually stay. There was no illegality, right? Not irregular migration. It is a legal aspect of that law. Why am I saying this? Because that argument, the argument that this was a fallacy on behalf of migrants, was that it led the government of Piñera, when he was running for president in 2017, to say that he was coming to clean up the house. And that has been his doctrine regarding migration the last 4 years. That led to, in 2018, when he, a couple of months after his administration began, to change the structure of migration in Chile. He proposed a regularization process that actually was failed. Less than 150,000 people actually regularized their situation in Chile, significantly less than was expected by the government, to have a new law that was based on his 2013 law proposal, and it was actually passed in December of 2020, and create two specific visas. One was the humanitarian visa for Haitian migrants, and the second one is the democratic responsibility visa for Venezuelans in Chile, for Venezuelan migrants. Now, that changed the rules of the game immediately, overnight. It led, now Venezuelan migrants could not enter the country using that tourist access, but they actually had to request a democratic responsibility visa in the Chilean consulates in Caracas and Puerto Ordaz, right? That, the only thing that it really led was to an increased change in how Venezuelan immigrants enter the country. For example, in 2018, there were 101 Venezuelans that entered the country through non-authorized ports. In 2017, there were 9. In 2019, so once this visa had been into effect for about a year, 3,300 Venezuelan immigrants entered through non-authorized entry ports. 13,000, I'm sorry, yeah, 13,000 in 2020, and another 18,000 by July of 2021. So in the last 10 years, 34,000 Venezuelan immigrants enter the country through unauthorized areas, which 95%, 98% were in the last years. So the democratic responsibility visa only created irregularity. And that, you know, as one said, bad policy are like bad medicine, it also kills. That has led to an increased number of deaths in the border, most of them Venezuelan immigrants. It is very similar in that sense to what the US did in the mid-1990s, in the sense that Chile created, or the Chilean government created, by closing the border, it actually deviated the flow of migrants to a hostile terrain. So now migrants have to cross the Andes at about 5,000 meters, 15,000 feet above the sea level, between 4,000 and 5,000 meters, in an area that is dry, extremely dry, one of the driest deserts in the world, where you have significant changes in temperature, and where there's actually almost no help from anyone. There's only very small villages in that area. At the same time, the visa that would allow Venezuelan immigrants to enter the country, they had to be requested in Caracas or in Puerto Ordaz, actually was not being useful. Of the 450,000 people that applied for that visa between April of 2018 and September of 2021, only 14% were approved. So 86% of the people that requested a visa that was almost sold as a promise of help from the Chilean government were denied that visa. So Chile went from a doctrine of being a welcoming country, that was Bachelet's doctrine in the previous government, that it had a lot of issues, but it was at least an idea, to a cleaning up the house doctrine by Piñera that led to a significant number of irregularity and actually death. Okay, how do, just to close, in our research, what we did, we asked immigrants what the Venezuelan immigrants, what they thought about this. And there is a important division between, or differentiation between those who arrived before 2018 and those who arrived after 2018, in terms of class, in terms of income, in terms of education, in terms of relations with the country. Venezuela was one of the main receivers of Chilean exiles during Pinochet. That meant that the first who arrived to Chile, Venezuelan immigrants that arrived to Chile in the 2015 year, a significant number of them had some form of connection with the country. Obviously, because of income, because of education, those who arrived before 2018 came by plane, while the ones that came after came either by buses or walking, right? And that made a difference in how migrants were received, both by other migrants and by the Chilean government itself. Just to close one thing, the law was approved in 2018. We have a significant change in government that's going to start in March. The government is going to start in March. The people that are working on migration on that government were people that were very, very against the migration law that was just passed. So these moments, actually, I personally have no idea what's going to happen with that migration law. Maybe there's going to be a push to develop a new law, which is going to take time, or change specific parts of that law. I'm not sure. That's we actually at this moment we don't know what's going to happen in terms of migration law in Chile. So that's it for now. Thank you very much. And I'll wait for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor, for again that great overview and kind of insight into the historic transformation of Chile as a migrant receiving nation. And finally, I will turn it over to Professor Gisela Zapata. And a reminder, please continue to send your questions into the Q&A, and we will come to them as we move into that section. But Professor, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to be doing some PowerPoint here because I want to show you some graphs. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Astrid and the Committee on Forced Migration for the kind invitation. And I'm going to talk about Brazil's political institutional response to Venezuelan displacement, which is what I was asked to do. Okay, so let's begin with a little bit of context. The first thing that you need to know is that historically, Brazil has been a country of immigration. Although from the 1980s onwards, the country actually went through a period of high immigration. But beginning in 2011, there was a change in the country's migration pattern, both in terms of volume with the intensification of intra-regional migration flows and in terms of the composition of the migrant population with a diversification of migration motives and drivers. So as you can see in this graph here on the left, a significant and growing part of immigrants in Brazil come from other Latin American countries, such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Haiti, and the countries of Mercosur, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. Brazil is the 5th country of destination for Venezuelans in the region, hosting about 260,000 Venezuelan citizens. This graph to the right, you can actually see the exponential growth in the number of asylum applications. And so between 2011 and 2019, the country received more than 230,000 asylum applications, as you can see on that graph, primarily from Venezuelans, Haitians, and other countries. Despite this growth, the migrant and refugee population, which stands at around 1.5 million, represents less than 1% of the total population of the country. As you know, Brazil is a very large country, not only in terms of population, but also in terms of its territory. On the other hand, Brazil also has a very modern and progressive legal framework for the governance of mobility. Until recently, migration policy was governed under the Foreigners Statute, a legacy of the military dictatorship that lasted until 1985 and that treated immigrants as a threat to national security. Then in 1998, in 1988, the federal constitution that marked the process of re-democratization of the country explicitly guarantees equality before the law for non-nationals residing in the country. And then in 1997, the Refugee Act incorporated into the Brazilian legal system the 1951 Geneva Convention, its 1967 protocol, and also the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, and particularly the clause to allow persons fleeing from contexts of quote unquote serious and generalized violation of human rights to seek. Also, in 2009, Brazil implemented the residency agreement for nationals of the Mercosur states, allowing the free mobility and residence of citizens of the common market and associated countries in Brazilian territory. And more recently, after much pressure from civil society, the anachronic foreigners statute was replaced by the new migration law, which represents a radical break and a radical change with regards to the treatment of mobility in the country. This law recognizes migrants as subjects of rights and promotes the fight against xenophobia and non-discrimination as central principles of migration policy. However, the current political dynamics, which have once again given a leading role to the state's security apparatus, and the most conservative Congress seeing re-democratization, threaten the effective implementation of this progressive regulatory framework, as became very clear with the decree that regulated the law, the new migration law, and more recently with the pandemic. But we can talk a little bit more about that during the Q&A. Here, I would like to emphasize the importance of the Cartagena Declaration in the context of mass displacement from Venezuela. So this instrument is a clear effort in the direction of addressing some of the limitations of the 1951 Convention by extending protection based on 5 particular situational elements that you can see highlighted on the screen, rather than extending protection on the basis of individual persecution or threats. As you may have also heard, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and several civil society organizations and scholars have repeatedly called on governments in the region to use this legal instrument to protect fleeing Venezuelans to pretty much no avail. So here, I would like to call attention to 3 particular things that distinguish the Brazilian response from the rest of the countries in the region. And I'm going to call attention to the little red squares that you see on the screen. The first is that in March of 2017, right before the passing of the new migration law, which was only passed at the end of the year, the National Immigration Council, CINIC, passed a normative resolution to grant temporary residence permits to Venezuelans for a period of up to 2 years. This legal maneuver was in effect a backdoor to extend the Mercosur residency agreement to Venezuelans and allowed the government to alleviate the pressure on the understaffed asylum system without having to backtrack on its political stand vis-a-vis, quote unquote, the Maduro dictatorship. Because Brazil, as you may know, was one of the countries that had been advocating for Venezuela's suspension from the Mercosur bloc since the beginning of the humanitarian crisis in the country. Just for context, only Argentina and Uruguay have used the existing Mercosur agreement to grant residency to Venezuelans, despite the country's effective suspension from the bloc in 2017. The second thing that I want to call your attention to is that in February of 2018, the government federalized the management of migration from Venezuela under something that they call Operação Acolhida, Operation Shelter. And this is the first mission of a humanitarian nature undertaken by the Brazilian armed forces inside Brazilian territory. Under that operation, right underneath it, you can see the government set up the interiorization program in April 2018. And this program was effectively created to alleviate the pressure on the border states by voluntarily relocating Venezuelans from Roraima to other Brazilian states. And this is something that also makes the Brazilian case so unique. Unlike what is happening in most countries of the region, most Venezuelans who cross the border into Brazil tend to remain living in the border state of Roraima, and some of them also in the state of Amazonas. And finally, in June of 2019, over 3 years after the intensification of flows from Venezuela, the National Committee for Refugees, CONARE, declared Venezuela as suffering from quote unquote, grave and massive violation of human rights. This decision effectively made Brazil the first country in South America and the second in Latin America after Mexico to employ the Cartagena Declaration to extend humanitarian protection to Venezuelan citizens. And while Brazil has employed the prima facie or group recognition, simplifying and fast-tracking the process for determining some refugee claims, in Mexico, the application of Cartagena was an internal decision made by the Committee for Refugees, COMAR, with the López Obrador administration actually never positioning itself about the quote-unquote Maduro regime. So to sum up, let me go forward here. Brazil has recognized over 46,000 Venezuelans as refugees, most of them using the Cartagena Declaration, or the clause that is contained in Brazilian law of the Cartagena Declaration, more specifically. It has almost 91,000 pending asylum applications. It has granted residence permits to about 145,000 Venezuelans. That's about half of all Venezuelans living in Brazil. And also it has relocated over 65,000 Venezuelans to more than 700 municipalities around the country, as you can see in this map. And just to conclude, all in all, as I have recently argued in that paper that was recently published as part of the special issue coordinated by Cristiano and our colleague Feline Freyer, although Brazil has been, these are just some photos so you can actually see how the policies materialize on the ground. Although Brazil has been internationally praised as an example of good practice for its reaction to the Venezuelan exodus, its policy response has been far more complex and ambiguous, lacking the clear progressive character portrayed by the international policy community. And so as I show you in the presentation, despite having one of Latin America's most progressive migration and refugee legal frameworks, the Brazilian state's framing of this situation, this influx of mixed flows from Venezuela as a temporary quote-unquote migration crisis has meant that the government has focused on offering regularization instead of integral protection, primarily through the adoption of ad hoc, short-term, ambivalent solutions and legal mechanisms for the admission and settlement of Venezuelans, with very, very little articulation with other long-term intersectorial economic policies. And these have ranged from the implicit temporary extension of the Mercosur agreement, because that's effectively what it was without calling it that, the belated application of the Cartagena definition to a limited number of asylum-seeking Venezuelans. As I show you, there are over 90,000 pending applications still, and these after 3 years of ad hoc legal maneuvers to limit Venezuelans' access to asylum. And also they include the militarization, as you can see clearly in this picture, and the internationalization of border control and migration management that underpin the government's Operação Acolhida or Operation Welcome or Shelter. And I'll be here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And thank you to all on this panel today again for such in-depth and such important both information, statistics, and kind of the experiences of Venezuelan migrants, both those who have left, and as we'll talk about shortly, those who are left behind, those who are still in Venezuela. This is an ongoing crisis. This is not something that has necessarily been predicted to have an end or have an end date or a, expected number to leave. So I really want to bring first that discussion back. Fabiana and Professor Palacios both touched on this a little bit, the importance of remembering that this is an ongoing crisis. And so to first bring up this discussion as we move into some questions, I wanted to turn back to Professor Palacios, and a discussion you brought up was, again, those left behind, those who have not been able to leave Venezuela due to the ongoing crisis, and remittances being a huge source of inflow of money into the nation. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about the role of remittances from Venezuelan migrants who have left, and how that's affected poverty levels and lack of access and opportunities in the home country of Venezuela.
Thank you so much for the question, Astrid. This is a fundamental question because we have to remember the refugee crisis of Venezuela is the mirror of the flip side of a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. And one of the things that the ENCOVI household survey, which is very useful and is widely tracked by people that study social and economic developments and evolutions in Venezuela, is that those surveys are reporting that about 30 to 35% of households are now receiving remittances from abroad. A study conducted by the Inter-American Dialogue have put the level of remittances growing by $3 billion in about 2018 to almost $6 billion in 2020. This is second to oil revenues. So the relevance of remittances as a way to cope, as a way that Venezuelans are coping with the significant increase in poverty levels cannot be underestimated. So it is very interesting. The reports are showing that 70% of adults that migrate are providing remittances, that the remittances are about 20 to 25% of their annual income. They provide regular remittances throughout the year in various different forms. So anything that regularizes or provides opportunity for these refugees to be able to access work will actually help with the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, given that you're either depending on remittances from your loved ones or you are depending on government transfers. The extent of the diaspora help is not only in terms of cash transfers. For a long time, there had been a significant amount of in-kind transfers from different countries in Latin America and in the Western Hemisphere in general. People were sending boxes every month just to deal with the scarcity of food and basic health and medicines. And so these are the diaspora and the migrants are a very important way in which families are coping with the issues that they have. When we look at who is migrating and we look at the demographics, the people that study the demographic trends in Venezuela, what they see is that by and large, the people that live are younger people. And so Venezuela is losing out on its demographic boom just because what is staying behind is maybe much younger or children and much older people. And it is disrupting family lives. We now have an increase in single family households, and families are being disrupted and broken down. And so it is a forced economic migration because it's not possible to live in Venezuela with the minimum wage, as Fabiana had explained, and that remittances are playing a significant role now for about more than 2 million people in Venezuela. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That continuing on that economic question, Fabiana, I kind of want to direct the conversation to you as well. As Professor Palacios was talking about, the importance of remittances is so important to those left behind, those in Venezuela. But as we see, and you mentioned a little bit in your discussion, is the lack of economic support as well for those who are leaving, the lack of economic investment by international bodies in the crisis overall, and the double strain that this is putting on obviously Venezuelans who are leaving and sending money back home, but those arriving in nations where there is not as much economic support for them due to the lack of kind of international collaboration on the issue. And so I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more on this lack of international collaboration and funding that we're seeing, and what this might look like now as we see Venezuela going into a larger international regime with organizations such as the UN, among others.
Yes, first I would like to apologize for my internet connection because I am in Venezuela, and as you understand, services here are not so good. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that these migrants who arrive in these countries, besides not having access to work immediately while they were moving on when they arrive, they have need as food, they need shelter. And what the response plan does, what the R4V does, is it creates projects that are there to support the Venezuelan migrants, but also to support the host communities. And these projects are divided in, there's water and sanitation projects, there's health projects, there's food and shelter, there's nutrition projects, there's all types of projects, no? And what happens is that the international community, which is made up of countries, they donate. So you have countries like United States is one of the biggest donors, actually. Canada, the European Union, countries from the European Union, they donate money either to projects specifically or to organizations specifically. And what is happening is not that there's no funding, it's just that it's not enough. I mean, we are very, very grateful. In fact, we had the 2020 and 2021 donors conferences. But if you see the numbers, it's mostly loans. And there are loans for the IDB, there's loans from the World Bank. But of course, and loans are normally through a lot of years. It's not just 1 year. So we are very, very lucky that we are getting some help, but as you saw, as I said before, it's not enough, and it's very little compared to what Syria, which had a very similar, or yeah, like I said in numbers, a similar number of migrants, but they got a lot more funding, no? So what we would like is, although we understand country, you know, they do the best they can, but we would appreciate if we had more funding, but also if local NGOs could get more support as well, because local NGOs are the ones who know the problem better, and they're on the ground. But since there is probably less, there's less trust, maybe, so what gets funded are more the international organizations and the multilateral organizations.
Thank you, Fabiana, for going a little deeper in there. As I sent in the chat, the platform that Fabiana is referring to, R4V, is linked there, the regional response to the situation. And to tie a little bit more into the regional response, and bringing both Professor Zapata and Professor Rebecco into this conversation, is kind of the discrepancies amongst nations. We heard Brazil calling upon the Cartagena Declaration, one of the only nations to do so. A very different response from Chile, as Professor Rebecco spoke on. And so I think the important topic of conversation that has been brought up is this discrepancy in response, and how that affects where Venezuelans are going to, and if there is a direct connection there. So Professor Rebecco, I'll begin with you, if you can speak a little bit more about why Venezuelans keep continuing on to Chile. Who are the Venezuelans that are going to Chile despite this increase in less welcoming policies, as we see with the Piñera regime?
Thank you, and thanks everyone for the questions. Some really, really interesting questions. So as I said, Chile has built its international reputation in the last 30 years as a country of peace and country of prosperity, which has been shattered by the 2018 revolt or protests that is leading to a change in the constitution and many other things. That let's say international capital, if you wish, international social capital, has been key for attracting immigrants. That is one of the main reasons. There is, I think, that led to the idea that were more jobs in Chile and other places, the idea that it was a welcoming country, and that has been for all migrations. Now, I also mentioned this is, I think, one of the main reasons, or it's an in addition to that, is the historical connection between Chile and Venezuela. As a country that received Venezuela a significant number of exiles, there's a significant number of Chileans living in Venezuela, or where. And those were the first ones who left because they didn't need any visa or to enter the country. They could enter as citizens, and that includes their partners or their wives or husbands or partners, children, and others. And then there was also this other people that had connections through them with Chile, right? And the first group that came, as I said, highly educated. You have a lot of physicians that have been a significant assistance during the pandemic, by the way. That's another conversation, I know, but the relevance has been significant, even though they're not allowed, quote unquote, to practice medicine in Chile. You have business people originally, and as Luisa mentioned, a lot of young people. Now, those were mostly who came before 2018. After 2018, as it was in the case in most countries in Latin America, those who arrived had higher levels of poverty, lower levels of education, and less credentials, educational credentials. And that is those are the ones who are arriving now. We're seeing also an increase in family members, especially in the case of those who died. Sadly, all of them came to Chile because they were a family member of someone who was already in the country, or most of them were, those that we know. So the new migration includes older people, but not significantly older, just parents of those who are already in the country. That is what we know now. Now you have to think that also that the Chilean government closed its borders in March of last year. No, sorry, what year are we? March of 2020. And it has been fairly close for the last 2 years. And that also has led to this hostile terrain, moving the migration to hostile terrains. Hope I'm answering the question.
Thank you. And I will direct the same question to Professor Zapata, specifically on the Brazil case and this increase as we see in Operación Acolhida, and how has that either resulted in an increase of Venezuelans, or who are the Venezuelans that we're now seeing entering into the country?
Yeah, well, in the case of Brazil, actually, that was one of the first things when we started researching this issue of Venezuelan migration. That was one of the things that we tried to understand. So who were the Venezuelans who were here before this so-called crisis began? And we went back to look at all the census data that we had up to then. So then until 2010, which was the last census that was conducted in Brazil. And according to that last census, there were less than 3,000 Venezuelans residing in Brazil, okay? The interesting thing is that most of these Venezuelans residing in Brazil, or effectively those that had been captured by the census, were people who had high levels of education, were concentrated in their productive ages, and they worked mainly as professional scientists and intellectuals, okay? And this trend pretty much continued until 2014. When the contours of this kind of, what we call crisis migration began to emerge, then we began seeing a diversification in the profile of the people who were arriving in the country. So different from what used to happen before, most Venezuelans who arrive in Brazil actually do so crossing the land border in the northern part of the country, the state of Roraima specifically, and more specifically in the city of Pacaraima, which has a twin city on the other side of the border with Venezuela that is called Santa Elena de Guairén. And that is the only place along the 2,000 plus kilometers of border where you can actually, where the two countries connect, because the rest is pretty much forest. So what we have is most of the people in the country right now, we have more or less the same amount of women as men. I think we have a little bit more men, but just like over 51% or something like that. We have most of the people here in that last wave are people that have high school degree or some university education, okay? And the majority of them remain still in the border states. So one of the things that attracted or different to the sort of connection that Cristian was talking about, despite the fact that these countries have this very large border and share this border, and there had been some cross-border activities taking place, primarily commerce around those two towns that I just mentioned, there wasn't historically much immigration or migration between the two countries, okay? And so most of the people who started coming here actually did not have a connection to Brazil. In fact, the first group that was seen crossing the borders, the northern border, were indigenous people from the northern part of Venezuela. Okay, so there wasn't much of a connection there. And according to the research that we did back in, I think it was 2017, with Venezuelan migrants who had recently arrived, what they said was basically that Brazil became an option, or Brazil became an option because there was no other option. They just simply didn't have the money to travel far. And also because Brazil allowed Venezuelans to enter the country with any sort of documentation that they had in hand. So Brazil never requested a valid passport. It never requested a valid ID. Any sort of identification will do to allow you to enter the country. And so that was a big draw, as it may, for many people who were unable to get the required documentation that was requested in most countries of the region. And also at the time, since the majority had gone to Colombia and effectively had, there were transnational families that had gone to Colombia, there was already a lot of talk about how rough it was to be in Colombia. So a lot of people decided against going to Colombia because the relatives or people that they knew that had gone to Colombia were not having a very good time. And at the time, the crisis in Brazil wasn't so pronounced as it is today. So relatively speaking, it was closer, it was cheaper, they could cross by land, they could cross with any document that they had in hand, different to what was happening in other countries. And I think that's pretty much it. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. I think the question that was asked specifically from the audience brought in that conversation of both the regional response and the national response, as you both pointed to. So thank you very much on that. As was mentioned with the case of Chile, Venezuela and Chile had some sort of historic connection. And as we see, you mentioned Brazil's very different situation, but we see with Colombia has often been cited as a quote example for the region, with the past of Colombians going to Venezuela and Venezuelans going to Colombia, and that continuation of the relationship. However, I also want to bring up a specific point, and I will open this to any panelists who sees fit to respond, is the presence of xenophobia against Venezuelans. It is a region where there has been obviously a regional response, differing responses by different nations, and whether a nation has had some sort of historical relationship with Venezuela, we are seeing a very different response. And many Venezuelans have cited rises in hate and violence and attacks on them for being Venezuelan, for being migrants, for very similar discussions as we see with immigration that is not regularized. So if someone on the panel would like to speak a little bit more to the presence of xenophobia and what that looks like in the region.
I can start with the case of Chile. Until, let's see, October 2016, the presence of migration in the Chilean media was extremely small. I've been studying attitudes towards immigrants in the Chilean press since I graduated from college 20 years ago. And I follow the presence of xenophobic or at least discriminatory remarks in the Chilean media since 1990. And until October of that year, 2016, of August, yeah, about September, October, the number of articles that talked about migration was extremely low compared to a larger number of articles in the Chilean media. And then at some point it skyrocketed, right? I can say there's a specific interview that the Chilean chief of director of immigration services gave as probably a starting point, where he resigned to his position. And that year, the municipal elections of that year is where we first see migration becoming a topic of political discussion, of election discussion, right? It was specifically in the case of Antofagasta, a city in the north that has a large proportion of Colombian migrants at then. And a year later, when it was Piñera, when it was the election that Piñera won, we have immigration becoming a central issue in the election, in the discussion of the election. And that sort of retro or had a feeding loop with how people started talking about migration in Chile. And that led to increasingly xenophobic remarks. Now, Venezuelans at that time, since they were wider than other migrations, did not receive the blunt of this. Haitians were obviously the main center of xenophobic attacks. Obviously, Afro-descendants from Colombia and from Peru also. People, Peruvian people had more indigenous roots as well. But in that year, in that period, there was an increasing number of not direct, but in many indirect attacks against Haitian immigrants. It is after that we see that there's a reaction against, it's after 2018 that we see there's an increasing reaction against Venezuelan migrants, especially those who have less economic or lower economic backgrounds. And in our study, what we did is we actually asked Venezuelan immigrants what they thought about immigration. And it was a qualitative study, so it's not generalizable to the entire population, of course. But what we saw is that there is, yes, there is xenophobic against from Chileans towards immigrants, but there's also xenophobic attitudes within the Venezuelan immigration as well, both against other immigrants from other countries and to those poorer Venezuelans who were arriving. And that was problematic. It's very similar to pulling the ladder after me situation in the US and many other countries. But we're seeing that the Venezuelan migrants that arrived before 2018 were less inclined to welcome their own nationals. After 2018, after the protest in October 2018, we have a very interesting, very paradoxical situation where Venezuelans are at both times both the causes of that protest because they were all Chavistas, or they were against any kind of reform because they left Venezuela, then they were all anti-Chavez, right? So if you grew up Venezuelan, you could be both at the same time, right? Or you be called both at the same time, depending on from where. So Venezuelans were seen not only I don't want to say xenophobic racism, but a scapegoat in many cases of what was happening politically in Chile, right? And they were told that they were going to, all of them were going to vote for the extreme right and other things. So that's the kind of xenophobia that we have at this moment in Chile.
Yeah, I can also make a comment on that here in Brazil. So, as I said, migrants and refugees represent a very small percentage of the Brazilian population. And so, for a very long time, let's say, it wasn't something that wasn't very much discussed in the media, right? So migration began to be discussed also, as in the case of Chile, with the arrival of a large number of Haitians after the earthquake in 2011. But particularly in relation to Venezuelans, what we have is mostly anecdotal evidence. We don't actually have hard data to tell you how many people have suffered discrimination for being Venezuelans. And so mostly, or this issue or this talk about, the number of Venezuelans crossing the border became more prominent in the context of the presidential elections. And I am talking about the context of a presidential election where Bolsonaro was one of the, before Trump, calling immigrants the scum of the earth and things of the sort. And so in this environment, some people who were running for government at the state level or municipal level, and Bolsonaro himself, used this very derogatory language to refer to immigrants. And that effectively created the conditions for some of the anecdotal evidence that we have and that was widely reported in the media. So in 2018, in Pacaraima, that city where most Venezuelans cross, actually, a group of Brazilians actually set a camp of Venezuelans on fire while singing the national anthem. And after that, about 1,200 Venezuelans actually crossed the border back into Venezuela. And just some data that I have here, very fresh, we are doing a study for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees here in Brazil with the people, the Venezuelans who have relocated through the interiorization program. And one of the questions that we asked them effectively was if they had been discriminated against because they were Venezuelans. And we conducted a representative survey in the whole country. And according to that data, about almost 1/3 of Venezuelans reported that they had been discriminated against for being Venezuelans. But again, we have very little data. What we have is mostly anecdotal evidence. Apart from that, we also know that, for instance, during the pandemic, I think it was last year or the year prior in 2020 or 2021, an immigrant from Africa was actually killed during an argument at a bar because he was talking about how he had access to the government's help, financial aid. And the person just took issue with it and killed him, basically. So we have very, a few incidents that are very telling, as it may, of the issue of xenophobia in the country.
Thank you both for those remarks and those important points. As we near the end of this discussion, and again, thank you to all of you for being here and for our attendees as well. I want to ask two closing questions, first to Professor Palacios and then to Fabiana to kind of close us out. Seeing that it doesn't seem, we may not see an end in sight for the situation in Venezuela. For those who don't know, today in front of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, there's a presentation on the report on Venezuela's experiences as well as their history with human rights violations in the country. These discussions are rising in an international scene. And so, Professor Palacios, I want to ask you on the side of internally within Venezuela, what does this future look like for those still there, and how is this discussion being expanded into the world as well?
So, Astrid, this is a complex, I think, answer because like everything in Venezuela, there are no simple answers. And let me first say that there has been some stabilization. And so the declines, the double-digit declines in GDP and economic activity that we were seeing seem to have stabilized, in part because what you have seen is a significant recovery of oil prices. And the Venezuelan government has managed to circumvent the oil sanctions and has also seeing an increase in oil production and oil exports, which means at this level of high oil prices, there's more money flowing into the government coffers, and that is stabilizing somewhat the situation. The other thing that is happening is that given that I explained that Venezuela was living under hyperinflation, and here we have people that are from countries that have lived through hyperinflation, what happened in the country was a de facto dollarization, and the dollarization of the economy, that has meant is that it has helped with the stabilization of prices. And so there has been more stability. So now Venezuela is not in hyperinflation. It's the highest inflation globally, but it seems to have stabilized somewhat the situation, helped by a little bit more rationality on macroeconomic decisions taken by the current government, and a very high level of oil prices, which is helping the situation. So that means that the situation for, I would say, for the richest parts of Venezuela has stabilized as well. And I want to step, and if you allow me a little bit on this issue. One of the things that has happened with the humanitarian crisis is that Venezuela has seen a significant increase in income inequality from those that can have somehow access to dollars and those that do not. And so if you're a household and you have family abroad and you have access to remittances, or you have dollar savings, it makes a huge difference. And so that has created huge income inequality at home and has led to stabilization in some of middle classes households. That does not solve the situation for the rest of the population. And so the conditions, economic conditions that prompted all of this migration have not really changed. There's no economic opportunities. There's no employment, what I explained from the collapse of the state, but also the significant destruction of the private sector means that there's no economic opportunities and no jobs. But all of the households either depend on remittances or dollar savings or government transfers. With the government having more oil revenues, there's more transfer. So I don't know how that is going to impact the dynamics for flows of migrants going forward. That said, in order to revert the conditions that caused this migration, as I said, the migration crisis is the humanitarian crisis not being able to be contained within Venezuelan borders. It's a mirror image of one. So and I spent some time explaining the root causes because stabilization doesn't mean an improvement necessarily on the living conditions of everyone else. And therefore a reversal of those flows. There has to be addressing the root causes of what caused this humanitarian crisis will take significant amount of time and willingness on the part of the government to make the significant changes that need to be made, including all of the issues that are contained in the Sustainable Development Goals, in which is one of the reasons why Venezuela is categorized as a fragile state, because it is not only that you manage to eliminate hyperinflation, it's that clean access to water, access to clean electricity, gender equality, poverty, human rights. There are many things that are in the list of things that need to change in Venezuela in order for us to address the root causes of this humanitarian crisis, and therefore to reverse and start to solve some of the issues.
Thank you for a little more that information internally, that it's looking like, as we've heard from so many, this migration flow continues, but as you said, until it's solved at the root, there's so many more complexities that evolve as inequality increases, and those who are leaving are poorer, are not the ones as we're seeing in earlier stages. And to close out this discussion, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Fabiana to look a little bit both inside Venezuela and out. The question has arisen various times about the regional response. We have seen a discrepancy, as we've talked about, Brazil with refugee status as Mexico, and this idea of a universal status or some sort of way to respond holistically to the crisis. So to close out the discussion, I want to ask you, how do you see the work of the international community in convincing nations to provide residency, work permits, whether it is refugee status or some other status, and how that might affect the long-term view of this migration crisis? Fabiana, you are on mute.
I'm sorry. Okay, in theory, when they established F4V, after a while, there was the Quito Declaration on Human Mobility of Venezuelan citizens in the region. And then they created a plan, which was the action plan that outlined a number of regional priorities, which included information exchange, solutions for regularization, including the reduction of costs, and document recognition. So the first idea was to create, the countries promised or said they were willing to create mechanisms, maybe not for all, that would permit better regularization and lower costs to apply for visas and for residence permits. However, as we know, local politics play a role. So the change in governments has made things harder in some places. In some cases, it's made it easier. The reason why, for example, in Colombia, they created the I forgot the name. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I forgot the name. Well, in Colombia, they gave the status. Well, and so it's because of local politics. And so this goes a little bit with xenophobia, because if there's a lot of xenophobia in a country and these governments want to win re-election or want to win elections, it's going to impact how they will treat Venezuelans. So to the effect that each country is a sovereign country and can make their own decisions, it's going to be very hard for the international community to establish like one plan for all countries. So it's not like the European Union where maybe they can make a decision like that will be, and they don't even do it, no? But if it's not like you have one supervising entity that can say, okay, everybody do this. So I see it as very hard, and it's going to depend a lot on local politics. Temporary status, sorry, yes.
Thank you. And as we've heard from all these panelists, the reaction and response by nations is significant in how we see the rest of the migration crisis evolving, whether we see an end in sight, both internally within Venezuela and externally. I want to say thank you very much to all of you. We are about at time for this discussion. I think it was a very wonderful and very diverse perspective that we were able to bring together. Muchísimas gracias to all of you again for joining us. And thank you to all of the attendees, to the Committee on Forced Migration at the Columbia Global Centers, and for all the support here at Columbia. And with that, I wish you a great rest of your day, and thank you very much for joining us.